Ken Wilber, in your model of levels of consciousness, what do you believe are the origins of narcissistic personality disorder?
Right. Well, the specific narcissistic personality disorder was first discovered and suggested by Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. His inner circle was composed of all bona fide geniuses. And you've heard the names of many of them: Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, and Salvador Ferenczi. Um, but after Freud's, and for Freud, it represented the original stance of a human being was narcissism, which meant a hyper-emphasis on the self, and we would call it egotistical. And for Freud, that was our original stance. And subsequent developmental psychologists have maintained that, according to their research, the first state that a human being had was when it was born, and also in the latter parts of the womb. But when it's born, it just really couldn't distinguish. The mind wasn't well developed, and it had not yet learned to differentiate itself from its environment. So whenever a mind came up with a word or a symbol or what's technically called a signifier, like if I use the word tree and I write T-R-E-E, that's a signifier. And what comes to my mind when I see the word signifier is called the signified. And what generally would come to my mind is some image of a tree or some idea of a tree or something like that. And the actual tree itself, which is being represented by the word tree, is called the referent. So we have a signifier, a signified, and the referent. And for Freud, and certainly for subsequent developmentalists, when we're first born, because our mind is not well developed, it cannot itself distinguish between the signifier and the referent. So this stage is often called the magic stage, because the mind thinks that if you change the signifier, you'll automatically change the referent, because it can't differentiate the two very well. So for the first 6 months to a year or so, the mind is one with everything it's thinking about. And so it imagines that if it changes the signifier or the symbol or the word, it'll actually change the real thing, because it can't tell them apart. The mind is not developed enough to be able to distinguish between the signifier and the referent. So that's technically called the narcissistic condition, because it treats everything as if it were an extension of itself or its own ego. And that's technically what the definition of a narcissistic disorder is. And so what happens as the mind is developing is that if something goes wrong at that early stage of development, the mind will never be able to get out of its initial stage of development, which is that the signifier is not differentiated from the referent. So the mind treats everything as if it's an outpouring of its own being.
Yes. And Ken, you said if something goes wrong, what do you make of the idea that narcissistic personality disorder is caused by a child being abused or pedestalized, things like that?
Well, that's one of the things that developmentalists have found can cause the signifier to not well differentiate from the referent. And so if the child is abused or sexually abused or physically abused, emotionally abused, that will tend to freeze the mind at that early state because it's being hit over the head or had some adult have sexual relations with it or something like that. Some very real trauma can freeze the mind in that early state.
Hmm.
So I think that, and I think that's an accurate view of the situation.
Hmm. How do you think that narcissism then is shifting from this normal state in the child to something pathological, where
Right.
in an adult it can cause them to abuse others and be very harmful?
Yes. Well, the adult themselves have to be quite sick and quite
Hmm.
ill.
Hmm.
And it might be that they themselves have a narcissistic personality disorder. And so they are poorly differentiated from the environment or people in the environment or reference in the environment, reference for its own signifiers or words or symbols. Um, but the adult themselves have to be fairly well diseased or fairly well sick or something really broken for them to do that to a youngster.
And in general, what do you think causes pathology as we are moving through this development, this ladder, so to speak?
Well, developmentalists point out many different things that can go wrong. And the simplest, as I said, is a severe trauma to the mind, the body, or to the brain as it's growing and developing. And so it doesn't very well differentiate its own signifiers or symbols or words from the things that they represent. And that's a major type of trauma that occurs. And when it happens to a youngster who's 6 months old or 4 months old or something like that, when that happens to a youngster, then that tends to freeze the brain in that pathological state.
Hmm. And I've seen in your writing too, you've spoken about or written about how we can misinterpret our own depths. What is happening in that, and how does it relate to pathology?
Yeah, we can misinterpret our own what?
Depths, our own internal being. Having a sense of truth in who we are and repressing things.
Well, yes. I mean, that would be part of the trauma that would cause the narcissistic condition to be set or frozen or not grown out of. And so, as the mind is learning to differentiate from its environment and it suffers a major trauma, that will stop the mind from differentiating from what it's thinking about or what it's representing or what it's signifying. Um, and that's one of the major traumas that developmentalists have discovered causes the brain mind to freeze in this narcissistic condition.
Hmm. And you're using the phrase freeze. Is that different from things like repression or dissociation, or are they interchangeable?
Yes, that would be a type of dissociation
Hmm.
or repression or freezing. And that stops the brain from continuing to grow and develop and learn to differentiate its signifier from its reference. And that, of course, is the definition of a narcissistic personality condition. And that's generally what happens. And I'm using freeze to mean dissociation or repression or some pathological freezing.
Mm. So, what can we do to address these dissociations, this repression, this freezing?
Right. Um, Well, first of all, don't traumatize the young brain mind.
Mhm.
And that's once it happens, then you're sort of stuck with it. And it's very hard if you have these major conditions that are set in the first year or so of life. They generally, Otto Rank invented two words that developmentalists tend to use. One was neurosis and one was psychosis. And psychosis is a very severe disorder. And the disorders such as schizophrenia or narcissistic schizophrenia, and that is, once that gets set in, because it's happening in the first 6 months to a year or so of life, it becomes very, very difficult to cure it. And then as the brain continues to grow, it moves from psychotic conditions into possible neurotic conditions. Neurotic conditions set in around age 4, 5, 6, 7. And most developmentalists recognize that this type of neurotic condition can happen at any time in adult life, because it means have a neurotic condition is not to have a psychotic condition.
Mm.
And that can happen basically at any time you grow out of the psychotic phase, which is the first year or so of life. Then if something goes wrong, it's generally referred to as a neurosis. Very sophisticated developmentalists come up with different types of neurosis or different stages of neurosis. And that's fine. If you want to do that, you're more than welcome to. I basically have what I call a fulcrum of development, which is a type of differentiation that occurs. And I have, beyond the first fulcrum, which would be a psychotic development, I have 5 or 6 or more further fulcrums of development, where what a fulcrum means is that you have the mind differentiating itself from further items that it's learning to be aware of. So I have maybe 8 levels of neurotic types of problems that can be created if something goes wrong at these post-psychotic levels. And that's fine. I don't generally refer to them as neurosis. I just refer to them as a fulcrum 5, a fulcrum 6, fulcrum 7, fulcrum 8 problem.
And Ken, when we have problems at these fulcrums, if we recognize them, what can we do to address them or to get at what we've been repressing or dissociating?
Right. Well, the first thing to notice is that the higher the fulcrum that you've developed a problem at, the easier it is to cure. And the simple reason is that if you have like a fulcrum 6 or fulcrum 7 or fulcrum 8 problem, that means the mind has already developed through sensory motor intelligence to pre-operational intelligence to concrete operational thinking. Concrete operational thinking is defined as thought thinking about the concrete world, hence concrete operational thinking. So if you go in the garage and get your bike off the wall and put your feet in the stirrups, those are all called concrete operations because you're brain mind operating on the concrete world. In this case, your concrete bicycle and its concrete foot pedals. So then when you get up to beyond concrete operational, it's called formal operational. And where concrete operational is defined as thought operating on the concrete world, formal operational thinking is defined as thought operating on thought. So you can see that that's a more developed and superior form of cognition. For that reason, it's easier to address problems that occur. So if you have like a fulcrum 8 problem, which would be the creation of a fulcrum 8 trauma, or repression or freezing or whatever term we want to use, that can often be cured by simply thinking differently. And because you do have the capacity to form fulcrum 8 thoughts, you developed a trauma when you developed fulcrum 8 in a pathological form. So what that means, though, is that you're capable of thinking according to fulcrum 8 pathology, and a fulcrum 8 pathology tends to be the stage beyond formal operational thinking, which I have 3 or 4 major stages. The immediate one beyond formal operational thinking is often called multicultural or pluralistic thinking, because where formal operational cognition or thought operating on thought tends to be a thought that creates universal systems. So on the previous stage, concrete operational, which I also call mythic, because that's what people do at that stage, is they form mythic signifiers. And a typical example of that is all the world's major typical religions, because they all work with mythic thinking. So if you read the Bible, you'll run across mythic thinking occurring on almost every page. So Christ is born of a virgin, he dies and resurrects, and all of those are all myths. They clearly did not actually happen, except into the mythic mind, and then they're all real. But that's not the way you want to go through life, thinking in terms of mythic stuff. It's just not a good way to do it. So what you can do if you have a fulcrum 8 or a mythic problem is simply stop thinking in terms of myths. And because you do have control over fulcrum 8, because you're at fulcrum 8, you can simply stop thinking mythically, and start thinking in terms of rationality or universal rationality. Or what happens when you get to fulcrum 7 and fulcrum 8 is you think about a referent or an object or some thought you're having, and that tends to take each higher stage operates on the previous stage, or can operate on it. And so what you're doing when you operate at a fulcrum 7 or fulcrum 8, which I call integral stages of development, because what an integral stage does is it takes the products of the previous stage, which is the multicultural stage or the pluralistic stage. And what that is the pluralistic stage is pluralistic because it looks at the products of that stage and it takes the products of those stages, which are multicultural truths, and remember, a multicultural truth is a truth that looks at the previous stage, which is Fulcrum 7, which was a rational thought. And what rational thought does is it looks at the previous mythic stage and starts dividing that up, because what it notices is as the rational stage forms just single unified systemic structures. So the rational stage will not make multicultural stuff because it's not at that stage. What it will do is simply look at the single unified structures. So what rationality will do is create unified structures. So it's where the mythic stage would create different types of thought. It would notice that, well, wait, there's not just, if you talk about chemistry, it's just chemistry. It's not Protestant chemistry versus Buddhist chemistry versus Hindu chemistry. It's just chemistry. And if you're talking about some country and its chemistry, it's the same chemistry for that country as it is for the country next to it. And it's the same as the chemistry in the country next to it, because it's all just one unified system or structure. The multicultural system notices that, well, wait a minute, there are differences, important differences between different nations and different cultures and different societies. And those, whereas the rational structure produced these universal systems, the multicultural or pluralistic structure produces a bunch of different systems. So it's sort of like the mythic stage that produced different myths. And it's unlike the rational stage, which just have universal single systems or single structures. So again, there wasn't Protestant chemistry versus Hindu chemistry versus, there was just a single universal chemistry. And what multicultural does is it looks at all the different cultural truths that differ from culture to culture. And that's why it's often called multicultural or pluralistic. And that's an important growth in cognitive capacity, because you're thinking about all the different types of truths that can occur in all the different types of culture worldwide. What the integral stages do, which is a huge growth, Claire Graves called them second tier, whereas all of the first tier stages, which are the first 6 or so stages, from sensory motor to pre-operational, the concrete operational to formal operational, those are all first tier stages, according to Claire Graves, because the one thing they all have in common is each of those first tier stages thinks that its truth and only its truth is the correct way to view the world. So it thinks that everybody else is wrong or stupid or infantile or childish or just basically plain wrong. And what the beginning of the multicultural truth does is divides all of the world up into multicultural or different truths for each culture. And it still recognizes like chemistry and the universal systems of chemistry, but it's also finding further multicultural patterns. And those are a very high developed form of cognition. But what I call it the green stage, what the green stage cannot do is it can't figure out how to draw together all of these different truths. So it's stuck with a multicultural pattern of truths. And if it gets really stuck there, it will tend to end up fragmented or polarized because it's just recognizing all these differences between cultures, but it can't unite them. It has no idea how to pull them all together. And that's why when we get to what Claire Graves called second tier stage, that's when, and I recognize two stages there. Most developmentalists recognize two stages. And it's not that there aren't higher stages, there are, but they're very rare. So the percent of the population that's at first tier, second stage, which I call teal, is it's often called, developmentalists will often call that the paradigmatic stage, because what it does is it takes 2 or 3 or so of the multicultural fragments and unites them. So it'll create, for example, it'll unite biology and chemistry and create biochemistry, and which is a paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn defined the term paradigm. And then the percent of the population that makes it to that multicultural stage and the first growth into integral stages is, they call it paradigmatic because that's what it is. And then the second stage takes all the different stages, and the second stage I call turquoise, and it takes all of the different stages of development and the different paradigms that were created, and it draws all of those paradigms together. And that's often called a cross-paradigmatic stage. And the percent of the population that reaches cross-paradigmatic is 0.5%. So it's not exactly, you're not going to run into that often. It isn't that there are higher stages. There are, and I've recognized up to 4 higher stages, but those are extremely rare and very uncommon to find those. So paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic are the second tier stages that Claire Graves recognized. And most developmentalists agree with his finding that there are multicultural stages and then paradigmatic and then cross-paradigmatic stages. But those are very rare. And turquoise is just almost non-existent. I mean, 0.5%. I used to have, when I lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, I was always I'd get tons of people that had read my stuff and wanted to talk, and so they would come over. And for some reason, almost all of them were boomers, and boomers all, as far as I can tell, almost every single boomer ever born decided that they were cross-paradigmatic. And they've come up with a new paradigm that's going to unite everything. And I would go, and what I would do is I had this hat, and on the front of the hat was just the symbol 0.5%. And I would just get that hat and put it on, and I wouldn't tell them what it meant or anything. It would just make me feel more at ease, realizing they're talking about something that they have no idea what's going on. But there it is. I think that the stage beyond turquoise or cross paradigmatic is each stage is made of holons, and a holon was a term invented by Arthur Kessler, and it means a whole which is part of a larger whole. And if you look at any developmental or evolutionary sequence, it's made of holons. As a matter of fact, the entire universe is made of holons. So, for example, we have quarks, and quarks come together to form protons and neutrons and electrons, and protons, neutrons, and electrons come together to form atoms, and atoms come together to form molecules, and molecules come together in large molecular chains to form single-celled organisms, and single-celled organisms come together to form multicellular organisms, and that has a whole tree of life. And each stage, because it's made of holons, is getting bigger because it's made of the previous stage plus its own additional holons. But all of that's true. It's true for individual stages of linguistic development. For example, letters come together to form words, words come together to form sentences, and sentences are made of holons that are words. Each word is a holon because it's made of holons, it's made of individual letters, but those letters are brought together to form a larger holon. So the whole letters come together to form whole words, and whole words come together to form whole sentences, and whole sentences come together to form whole paragraphs, and whole paragraphs form whole chapters, and whole chapters form whole books, or whatever you write. So everything in the universe is either a holon or it's a heap. And a heap is just a pile of stuff that doesn't have any really thick structure. It's not made of holons, or it's made of just really small level holons. And otherwise, it's like a heap of garbage. A garbage doesn't itself is not itself a holon because it's just made of heaps of garbage just thrown together. So everything in the universe is a holon or a heap. And that was an important breakthrough in, technically it would be called physics, but Arthur Kessler was the one who made this discovery, and Kessler was just a genius. I mean, he created the terms holons and holarchy and all sorts of stuff. He wrote a very famous book called The Ghost and the Machine, which is the ghost is, of course, the mind, and the machine is the body. And what he was trying to explain is how the mind operates on the body, because the one thing that is true of all ghosts is they can walk through walls. They don't have any trouble being slowed down by material things. They just walk through them, or they walk around them, or they fly over them, or whatever. But the ghost in the machine is a phrase that came to describe the mind in the body. So how does this ghost operate on the body? And Kessler came up with what he called holarchy, which is that the human organism is built of starting out with small holons like atoms, and then those atoms come together to form molecules, and those molecules come together to form single-celled entities, like in the real world, bacteria or viruses or so on. And those single cells come together into systems like the neuronal system, the digestive system, the muscular system, and so on. And all of those are operated on starting with the lowest holons, and the mind can operate on those because the mind itself is made of small holons. So at any event, this was just some of the many things that Arthur Kessler discovered. And he really was a genius. He was just a brilliant thinker. And I love reading his stuff because he was such a clear thinker. And he was just really an impressive guy. And of course, I immediately latched on to holons.
Yes.
And when I wrote Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, I just built everything on holons. Why? Because the universe is made of holons. Everything is a holon or it's a heap.
Mhm.
And whenever we have living organisms, they are holons. And they go up an entire holarchy or scale of increasingly larger holons, from atoms to molecules to cells to multi-cells to systems of systems and so on. And that was all Kessler's fundamental idea that I just took it and ran with and created a whole book out of it.
And Ken, we're talking about this building up of a person. A big element of that, and we've been talking about development, is also genetics. Our genes are making us in a way. What role do you think genes have in development, in predisposing us for disorder or anything like that?
Right. Well, an incredibly large part, because every gene is a holon, and it's a multiple holon. So it's dealing with second tier holons. But the gene is an outline or a blueprint of all proteins in the body. So that's incredibly important because basically proteins are the structural forms of every pattern in our body. So they're very important. And genes, which are large strands of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which are passed on when your parents have sex and come together to form second tier holons, which are genes. And these genes govern every proton in the body, which means it governs all of the substructures that the body is built out of. And that is basically, it governs the shape of our body. It governs every system in the body, every neuronal system, every digestive system, every respiratory system, every muscular system, every bone system. And it brings all of those together according to the pattern that you inherit from your parents. And that's saying quite a bit, because whenever the first cell was created, it was, of course, a holon. But science still doesn't understand how that first cell came into being. So they understand fairly well all the pre-life holons, but they don't understand yet how life emerged. And in my opinion, the reason they don't is that they just have four major forces that operate at the pre-life level, and they're called the strong and weak nuclear, the electromagnetic, and the gravitational. And they think all of those forces govern everything in the universe. But unfortunately, they're missing a fifth major force, which I call eros, and other philosophers would just refer to as, well, Stuart Kaufman, who's a member of the famous Santa Fe Systems Institute, which is probably the world's most famous studier of systems and systems theory in the world. And he refers to it as self-organization. And once you put that factor in with the other four, then you have a force that's driving those four to ever higher stages of self-organization. And so when you put that force in and make it a part of the universe, then you've explained all of the growth that you see in the universe. And of course, growth is the factor we need to explain life, and then multicultural forms of life, and multi-conventional, and so on. And when we add self-organization or eros, what we get is each holon has four drives, and the two horizontal ones are called agency and communion. Agency is the force to self-individualization or self-existence, and communion is the force that drives individual holons that all have agency. It drives different agentic holons to join together to form systems or cultures of holons. And then it has two vertical drives which govern how lower forms come together into higher forms. And that means that we have a form of eros, which I've explained already as self-organization, and then agape, and which is the lower force. And what agape is the force that makes a larger holon reach down and include the smaller holons. So we have a force that makes each holon stand out on its own, and we also have a force that makes each self-holon join together with other holons to form societies or systems or cultures. And then we have the two upper and lower. We have eros, which causes a separate individual holon to join together to form higher holons. And we also have those higher holons reaching down to enfold or include single or lower level holons. So with those major forces, those are enough to create every form we're aware of in the universe, including all life forms. And so that's an important part. And it's, of course, part of integral theory, because you want to explain how we get this world of integral reality that we're surrounded by. And we need at least four forces to do that.
And Ken, so we've talked about now how important genes are, and in the beginning we talked about development and things like personality disorders. What role do genes have in personality disorders? Maybe priming us, making us more susceptible, things like that?
Yeah. And if we do have genetic deformities or genetic brokenness, and when a gene breaks, which means it's as it starts to reproduce itself and create smaller versions of itself, it can screw that up. It can misrepresent or create a broken genetic product. And when we get that, then we have some gene that will misrepresent a proton or a protein, rather. And when it misrepresents the protein, then the protein will be either broken or misrepresenting what it's supposed to be. And that brokenness will cause the protein to malfunction. And so protein is doing things like creating the immune system and creating all the protons that will attack viruses and bacteria that get inside us. And if those are broken, the immune system won't work. And likewise, if stomach proteins are broken, we can't digest food well. And if our lungs are broken, we can't breathe, right? And so on. I mean, you get the point. Whenever a gene has a defective genetic core, that genetic brokenness will produce broken proteins. And proteins, of course, are the protein structures that we all make or are supposed to make in a healthy way. And if that's broken, then we'll produce brokenness. And that's a very bad product of a broken gene.
And the afterword to the newest version of your book, A Brief History of Everything, is a dialogue between you and Lana Wachowski, writer-director of The Matrix, one of my favorite films.
Yeah.
What do you see of your work in the film The Matrix?
Well, there are a lot of things, actually. The whole message of A Brief History of Everything I wrote that book after I wrote this huge sex, ecology, spirituality, which is some 800 pages of stuff. And the footnotes take a third of that thing. So it's sometimes that it's 3 books in one. But after I wrote Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, which is a somewhat difficult, the interesting thing about big books that I write, like Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, is actually each sentence is very clear and fairly easy to understand. It's just there's so many of them, you have to kind of be able to remember all of the sentences in order to get the full picture. So sometimes it's said my books are difficult, but they're not hard to understand on their parts. But putting all the parts together can get to be somewhat difficult. Because after all, what I'm claiming to do is unite every discipline we're aware of. I claim to unite chemistry and biology and physics and sociology and psychology, and there's room for all of it in this integral framework. So that's where that reputation comes from. But it's actually fairly straightforward, but it does require a bit of care, shall we say.
Yeah. And one of the phrases in your writing is often something along the lines of waking up. In The Matrix, one of those early scenes, we see Wake Up Neo come across the computer, and the song that plays over the final credits, I believe is called Wake Up by Rage Against the Machine. What is waking up in your terms, and how does it relate to The Matrix?
Right. And that's also a thing that the Wachowskis got out of Brief History, because it talks about waking up. And in subsequent books like my recent one, Finding Radical Wholeness, one of the things that it talks about is waking up and growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And these are, and there's also opening up and cleaning up and showing up. And I'll briefly explain those in a minute. But waking up and growing up was very important discovery for me to distinguish between these two types of development that human beings can have. Because waking up is the core of every mystical religious tradition the world over. And it's often called enlightenment or awakening. And it's called stuff like awakening, and I just call it waking up. Because what happens when you have an enlightenment experience is you actually feel like you are waking up. So like if were having a bad dream and you woke up, you go, oh, thank God, it's not real. And you realize that everything that you were experiencing was just a dream. It just wasn't real. And that's what you have in Zen Buddhism, if you have a Satori, or in Christian mysticism, if you have, like St. Paul said, let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. And that was a very good description of a waking up experience. Because what we did is we go from thinking that all of the things we're aware of out in the world as objects separate from our subjects are actually one with our subject. So every object we're aware of is actually one with our brain that's aware of it. So subject and object are not two. In the East, this is called non-dualism, although, again, all world's religions the world over have a waking up experience at their core. It's rare, but it is the core of true mystical traditions. And in that when you have this waking up experience, you realize that you're one with everything you're looking at. And that is a very profound realization, because it means all of the stuff you were aware of is not real. You really were living in, Plato's analogy was, we're all living in a cave, and there's a real sun outside, but the sun is casting shadows on the cave, and we think those shadows are real. And because we're all stuck in the cave looking at the shadows on the wall of the cave. And so that's what you get when you have a waking up experience. And I myself had my first enlightenment experience when I was 14 years old. And it was just an amazing experience. And the reason that it's taken to be the core of all the world's great mystical traditions, it's the core of Zen Buddhism, it's the core of Vedanta Hinduism, it's the core of Taoism, mystical Taoism, it's even the core of mystical Christianity. Again, that's when Paul says, make this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. That oneness is also called cosmic consciousness or universal consciousness or unity consciousness. It's when you have this waking up experience and you realize that you are one with everything in the universe. You literally have a cosmic consciousness or a universal consciousness. And this is the experience you have when you wake up. And about the same time that I had this waking up experience, I started studying developmental psychology, because I was absolutely floored to find out that every human being alive had grown up through a series of stages of development. And that just blew me away because I couldn't believe that I had gone through these 8 or 9 stages of development. But I had, and they were ones that, like Piaget called sensorimotor, which is in the first year or two of life, and then pre-operational thinking, which is ages 2 to 5 or 6, and then concrete operational thinking, which we mentioned before. It's like when I get on my bike and ride it. That's from ages 5, 6, or 7 to age 10, 11, or 12 years old. And then formal operational, which we talked about as thought, operating on thought, that is from ages 12 or 13 to age 20, 21, 22, the whole adolescent period. And then we have several more stages, all of Claire Graves' second tier stages, for example, which go from age 21 to 30s or 35 or even 40 years. And then that's where you start getting into turquoise stage, which is only 0.5% of the population. So that's where we sort of slow down. And anybody can grow through all stages. It's just very few people do. 0.5% of the population actually do. So that's not, we're not talking huge numbers here. But you can continue growing, and some people, 0.5% of the population, do continue growing. But I was just stunned to find that there were these 7 or 8 major stages of growth and development that I had gone through, starting when I was born and I was at the sensorimotor stage, and then starting around age 2 or so, I was at the pre-operational stage, which is Piaget's name for that stage. And he called it pre-operational because we really can't operate well on the environment because we're pre-operational. And then when we get to concrete operational, we can start operating quite well on the concrete environment. We can't yet operate on our own thoughts, so we don't, but we do operate on the concrete environment. And then starting in adolescence, when we move into formal operational thinking, that's when we have thought operating on thought. And that's when we can think about logic and mathematics and stuff like that. And then we can continue moving into multicultural modes of thinking, which take the universal systems of thought that rationality created. Like we said, there wasn't Hindu chemistry versus Buddhist chemistry versus Christian chemistry. There was just chemistry. And it was the same for all cultures and all countries. Wherever you had chemistry, it was the same. Wherever you had biology, it was the same. And those were the sciences. And then beyond that, we had multicultural or multi-conventional thinking, which was what I call green. And that was a stage that looked at all of the different cultures around the world and noticed that each of them had their own specific types of truths. And these were called multicultural truths. And those were all first tier because each of those, up to and including multicultural or pluralistic stages of development, thought that their truth was the only truth in existence. All the others were childish or infantile or just stupid or just plain wrong. And that was where second tier thinking could take over if you continue to grow and develop. And not everybody does. About 25% of the American population is at the green or multicultural stage of development. So that's a fairly decent number, but it's not.
And just to clarify, we would consider that something like moral relativism? Or is that just
Yes,
beneath that tier?
it, it in effect is moral relativism, but it can't really conceive of that very well.
Yeah.
But because everybody's got their own specific truth. And that's why the downside of multiculturalism is fragmentation or polarization. And America has a lot of fragmentation and polarization because we have 25 to 30% of us are at this green multicultural stage. And so we're seeing all these differences everywhere. And that can be confusing.
Yes.
Oddly. But if we continue growing, and 5 to 7% of us will grow into teal or the beginning of second tier integral stages. And what that does is the integral stage look at all the multicultural fragmentation and it unites them, it draws them together. So the first one, which is called paradigmatic, and we talked about this briefly earlier, paradigmatic unites, takes 2 or 3 or so of the multicultural differences and it unites them. So I gave the example of it unites biology and chemistry to form biochemistry, or it will unite psychology and sociology to form a multicultural unity. And then the next stage, if it goes further, is the turquoise stage, which only 0.5% of the population again reaches that. But what that does is that takes all of the separate paradigms which the teal stage had created, the first tier of these second tier stages, and it takes all of them and draws them together into, well, integral theory is a good example of a theoretical approach which claims to draw together all of the different paradigms that exist. So it claims to unite biology and chemistry and sociology and psychology and history and art and so on. And that is something that 0.5% of the population can do. And apparently 0.5% of the population will find my work interesting, which sort of cuts down on the amount of money I make from those books. But at any event, and by the way, the stage I have beyond turquoise begins a sort of mystical stage. And in particular, it begins the cosmic consciousness stages or the universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness stages. And those can continue in what I call the waking up stages. And I was talking about the difference between waking up and growing up. All of those stages that the small self grows through, the finite stages, those are, I call, growing up. And they're different from waking up, because waking up is where your small finite self, at whatever stage of growing up it's at, it's where this finite sense of self has a sense of oneness with the entire cosmos. And that can happen at most stages of growing up. And when I started studying growing up, as I said, I found out about growing up when I was about 14 or right after I'd had my first spontaneous awakening. But that growing up stage can occur at almost any stage, well, waking up can occur at almost any stage of growing up because the two are different. And the way I discovered they were different is when I was studying the stages of growing up, and there were, like I said, about 8 or 9 of them, and I studied over, well, in a book called Integral Psychology, in the back I have charts of over 100 developmental models. And what I did in each chart was simply give the names that they gave each of the stages. And because when developmental psychology became popular, it still wasn't understood very well that we had multiple intelligences. And what I found out is that each stage of multiple intelligence, and we have about 12 or so stages of multiple intelligence. So we have cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, or the perception of beauty, spatial intelligence, mathematical intelligence, and so on. And each of those, which is called the line of development, and if you draw the 8 to 10 stages of development, you'll have these lines of 8, 9, or 10 lines of which represent levels or structures or stages of development. And what you'll have is a whole series of a dozen or so lines, and each line goes through the same levels of development. So different levels going through different lines, but the levels are all the same. So it's same levels, different lines. And when I first discovered those, and I had the spontaneous mystical experience, I started looking for schools that actually taught these mystical stages of development in waking up. For example, Zen Buddhism is very well known for teaching. Zen Buddhism is only interested in one thing, and that's having an enlightenment experience. They call it a satori, and a satori is an actual experience of awakening to cosmic consciousness. And as I studied that, I ran across the very famous so-called 10 Zen ox herding pictures. And they're just 10 pictures that show the 10 stages of development leading to a full enlightenment or full waking up experience. And when I saw that there were 10 of those stages and that I had already figured out there were 8 to 10 levels or stages of growing up, I thought, wow, they're the same 10 stages going through both waking up and growing up. I'm going to be really famous for this discovery. And I was really happy about that. But the more I started studying them, the more I realized that they were very, very different things. Waking up and growing up, you could be very high in one and very low in another. Many people who develop all the way to integral stages have never had a cosmic consciousness experience in their entire life. They just don't even know what it means. And very few people actually know what a waking up experience is like. But no matter what stage of growing up you're at, you still don't know what a stage of waking up or cosmic consciousness is like. So I realized that when I first started studying these stages of wholeness, I thought there was just one type of wholeness, and you either whole or you were broken. But that's just not true at all. You can be whole, and at any stage of growing up, you can have this waking up experience. So that taught me that there were at least two very different types of wholeness. There was a waking up wholeness, and there was a growing up wholeness. And they were very, very different. And that led me to look for other types of wholeness. And I eventually found three other types. There might be more, but I've come up with 5 of them. And they are waking up, growing up, and then opening up, which is becoming and realizing you have multiple intelligences, 8 to 12 multiple intelligences. And I called realizing all of those multiple intelligences opening up, because you're opening up to all of your intelligences. And then cleaning up, which is generally described as being discovered by Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. And as we said, his inner circle were a group of 4 or 5 absolute geniuses, and that meant they scored genius level on IQ tests, and all of them had taken IQ tests, and all of them scored genius level, which basically means 140 or higher IQ, and all 5 of them scored 140 or higher. So these were some smart boys, and Freud tended to attract very smart people because he wrote very smart leveled stuff, and it attracted similarly smart people.
And to set the stage for cleaning up a little bit, just to give people a frame of reference. So we've talked about waking up, which is an enlightenment. We've talked about development or growing up, and that these can be independent. So at any point in growing up, you could have a waking up experience. And now we have cleaning up, which I understand as shadow work. I'm curious about what cleaning up is, how you suggest people do shadow work.
Right. So what Freud discovered is that the human mind, if it had parts of itself that it didn't like, could repress them and push them into the unconscious. And psychoanalysis, when he was asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? He famously said, where id was, their ego shall be. And that was actually a very brilliant summary of what psychoanalysis did, because it was taking our id, which was a split off part of ourselves, and reuniting it with our ego, or our full self. Most people know the terms id, libido, and ego from Freud, because Freud was the first to use them. What people don't know is that Freud himself never once used any of those terms. He never used the term ego. He never used the term id. They were put in by his official translator, James Strachey, and they're actually Latin terms. The id is Latin for it, and the ego is Latin for I. But Freud himself never once used the term id or ego. What he actually used were the real German terms. In English, he used the term it and I. So when they asked him, what is his new psychoanalysis, what he actually said was, where it was, there I shall become. And what Freud had noticed early on is that when people repress some part of their self, their I, they treat it as an it, as a third person. First person is words like I, me, or mine, and it's defined as the perspective of the person speaking. So again, that's an I, me, or mine. Second person is described as the perspective of the person being spoken to. So that's a you, thy, thine, stuff like that. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a he, she, they, them, it, or its. And what Freud actually said when they asked what does new psychoanalysis views do, is he said, where it was, there I shall become. And the easiest way to see what that means is by another one of Freud's genius followers, Fritz Perls. Perls was a superstar at Esalen Institute, which was the first growth center created in the United States by a good friend of mine, Mike Murphy, when he was left this exquisitely beautiful, absolutely gorgeous piece of land on the California coast next to the Pacific, and in a place called Big Sur, which is sort of halfway down California. But it's an absolutely gorgeous piece of land. And it had a few buildings on it. So he turned it into a growth center. And what that meant was he would invite all sorts of meditation teachers or psychotherapists or psychoanalysts or anybody who was teaching self-help ways that people could actually become one with stuff that they had split off or repressed, or they were looking for a Satori experience like Zen could offer. But any number of those types of growth therapies were taught at Esalen. And Esalen was so successful that by the end of the first year, from going to one growth center, namely Esalen, to growth centers around the country, there were 300 growth centers at the end of 1 year because Esalen was so successful. And I just love that. And I love Mike Murphy. He's an amazing guy. And he also, by the way, uses an integral perspective. And he's written some brilliant books on it as well. But you could see how where it was, there I shall become, if you look at, as I said, another one of Freud's genius followers named Fritz Perls. And Perls, who would give workshops at Esalen Institute, would there were usually at least 100 people that would show up to every workshop he gave because he was fantastically popular. And he would say, okay, who wants to work? And somebody would raise their hand and he'd say, okay, come on up. And he would put a chair down and he'd sit them in the chair. And then you put an empty chair in front of them. And he'd say, okay, what's your problem? And the person would say, well, I've got this anxiety and it's killing me. And Freud had already noticed that when people repress some part of their I self, they started referring to it in third person, as in it. So we say the depression, it overcomes me, or the anxiety, I can't control it, or there's my stomach, it's hurting. And so Fritz Perls would sit the person in the chair, and in the empty chair, he'd say, so maybe he'd say, aspirin, what's your problem? And they'd say, well, I've got this anxiety, it's killing me. And so Perls would say, okay, put the anxiety in the empty chair and talk to it. And they usually say, what do you mean talk to it? And Perls would say, well, ask it, why are you doing this to me? And you say, okay, oh, why are you doing this to me? Why are you causing this anxiety? And then he said, okay, now you sit in the empty chair and play like you're the anxiety and answer yourself. Why are you doing this to yourself? And so he said, okay, well, why are you doing this to me? And he said, okay, play the anxiety and answer. Why are you doing this to yourself? So he'd sit in the empty chair and he'd play like he was the anxiety, he was the it. So I'd say, well, I'm doing this to you because you're an idiot. You always screw things up. You're stupid and you're ugly and just all these horrible things that the anxiety would say to the person. And he'd say, okay, so play that anxiety. And so they'd play like they were the it. But when they'd answer as the it, they would answer as an I. So I'm doing this to you because you're an idiot or because you're stupid, or I'm doing this to you because you're no good or whatever. And so he would have them, he'd say, okay, just carry on a conversation now. Talk back and forth, and you play like you're the I and answer yourself as the I. And everybody in the audience could notice that within 10 to 15 minutes, the person's anxiety would start to alleviate. It would get better. And the reason was they were doing what Freud suggested, making it into an I. So where it was, their I shall become. And as they played the it and spoke to it as if it was an I, they were identifying with the it. They were making it, they were taking it back as part of their I. And within 10 or 15 minutes, everybody could see the anxiety diminishing. And that was because they're taking it and making it an I. So they were reuniting themselves with the part that they had split off to make it an it. So that's what Freud meant when he said, where it was, there I shall become. And that was finding another type of wholeness because they were uniting with their split off, repressed, fragmented it, or id, as most people know it. But that's not what Freud said. What he said was, where it was, there I shall become. And as we saw with the pearls example, that's exactly what would happen. And Pearls had already rather famously said, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes. And the funny thing is, even his harshest critics tended to agree with him. Pearls was a genius when it came to reuniting the it with the I by having them actually play the it and talk as an I. And so they were turning it back into an I. And therefore, within 10 or 15 minutes, their symptom, whatever it was, would tend to stop. And that was true whether they had an obsession, a compulsion, a depression, whatever it was, they were reuniting that it with their I. And so that became what I call cleaning up, because a lot of people, when they go to a psychiatrist, they'll say, I've got some stuff, I've just got to clean it up. So I just started calling it cleaning up. So that gave me waking up, growing up, opening up, or identifying with all of my multiple intelligences. And then cleaning up is finding the wholeness of reuniting an it, a repressed it, bringing it back to be one with my I. And that gave me cleaning up. And then the last one I called showing up. And that was when we...
And would you mind actually, if we go back to something a little bit on cleaning up?
Sure.
So I think we talked about that as kind of a freeing experience for people. And you have a quote that I found very interesting. Truth alone will not set you free. Truthfulness will set you free. What's the distinction there?
Between truth or truthfulness?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this gets to what I was explaining, which is showing up.
Okay.
And we've already said that first person is the perspective of this person speaking, so it's an I, me, mine. Second person is the perspective of a person being spoken to, so that's a you, thy, thine. Third person is the perspective of the person or thing being spoken about. And by the way, we can go up to fourth person, fifth person, sixth person, seventh person, even an eighth person. And what's fourth person? Fourth person is if you're thinking about first person and second person and third person, you're thinking about them all at once and how they fit together. You're using a fourth person perspective to do that, because you're aware of all three of them simultaneously, and so on with fifth person, sixth person, seventh person, and eighth person. And by the way, people like Jane Lovinger has a model of her developmental psychology, and she has 8 major stages. And by the way, her model is the most widely used model in the world to describe growing up stages. And she talks about stages of ego development. And she actually defines a stage by how many perspectives it can take. So the first person stage, which is just, you can only think of I, that is dominant during the first year or so of life, where the young child can only think about themselves, and they're so-called narcissistic, as we discussed. And then in the second year, when they can move on to second stage in Lovinger's model, they become capable of taking a second person perspective. And then when they can take a third person perspective, starting around age 4 or 5, then that's called the third stage. And her fourth stage is when you can take a fourth person perspective, and that generally starts with concrete operational thinking, or around age 5, 6, 7, up to age 10, 11, as we talked about. And she has 8 stages of development, and her 8th stage, which is turquoise, which is 0.5% of the population, not huge. But if you get to 8th stage, you can take an 8th person perspective. And that's how she actually measures it. And that's why her test, which tests for these 8 stages, is also the most widely used test in the world for determining stages of development. And so people can actually take 5th person, 6th person, 7th person, and 8th person stages of development. And that's pretty amazing. Anyway, those are the stages of development. And what I called, when I first realized that I first thought we had at least 4 stages of development. And so I just drew a cross that had 4 boxes, because each one of those, I just happened to label them. First person was the upper left. Second person was a you, and that occurred in a we, which was the lower left. And then the upper right was an object. The 2 right-hand squares were objective matter or energy, and they were third person and fourth person. So I called being aware of all 4 of those stages a showing up, because we're showing up for all of our possible perspectives. And now I use it, of course, to mean all 8, but there's still, because fourth person perspective is only reached by 0.5% of the population. The higher stages, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, are not that common. So I didn't worry about sort of leaving them out, although I used them in my formal definition of showing up, because we were showing up for all of the perspectives that we had available. And I actually I had 2 very important experiments that I used to learn, both opening up, which was, remember, waking up to all of our multiple intelligences. And the way I realized that was I knew about cognitive intelligence, moral intelligence, beauty or aesthetic intelligence, spatial intelligence, mathematical intelligence, logical intelligence, and so on. But I didn't think I was using that many of them, and that sort of shocked me. So what I did was I would take each day of the week and I would select a multiple intelligence, and I would just try to use only that intelligence all day long. So the first intelligence I chose was aesthetic intelligence, because I thought, I don't know what that even means. And what it means is you perceive beauty, aesthetics, beauty. And so I started in the morning and I would just look for beautiful things, because that would be my use of aesthetic intelligence. And I could find almost nothing of beauty. But the more I used it as the day went on, the more beautiful things I could see. So I was actually evoking aesthetic intelligence in myself. And the next day, I did moral intelligence. And I started out same in the morning. I would look for moral decisions I was making or moral choices, and I could find almost none. Although I was a fairly ethical person, I just wasn't aware of being that ethical. But as the day went on, just as with beauty, I started finding more and more ethical dimensions of myself. And by the time the day was over, I was just thinking ethically. Everything was ethical, and I was an incredibly moral person. And then I did mathematics and all of the moral intelligences. And that was one. And then the other one that I also did, like, use a different one each day of the week, was with showing up. And I use first person, second person, third person, fourth person. And then by that time, I was aware that there was a fifth person, and a sixth person, and a seventh person, and an eighth person. So I tried using those. So on the fifth day, I chose fifth person intelligence. On the sixth day, sixth person, seventh day, seventh person, eighth day, eighth person. And it took me some getting used to. So particularly for fifth person and sixth person, seventh person and eighth person, it took me a while to really get used to fifth person. And it took me a little bit longer to get used to sixth person, and a little bit longer to get seventh person, and fairly long to get eight. But by the end of the day, I was aware of all of these intelligences. And that was really, so I called that showing up, because I was showing up for all of my multiple perspectives that I had. So I had multiple intelligences, but I also had multiple perspectives. And the multiple perspectives are each represented by the four quadrants, because that's where I first just used first person, second person, third person, and fourth person. But that gave me a whole sort of integral view, where I had 5 different types of wholeness. And each wholeness was very, very different from the others. So waking up was very different from growing up. Growing up was very different from showing up. Showing up was very different from opening up. Opening up was very different from cleaning up. But I could find all of them in myself if I opened up to all of my multiple intelligences. And I could take them all the way through all 8 stages. And so that was, it gave me a much fuller sense of being whole, or being holistic, or unified. And that was a very big discovery for me. And that's what I started calling the integral approach.
You've talked a little bit about that 0.5% and numbers
Right.
and things. I actually have a question from a popularizer of your work. He goes by the online name Homath. Have you heard of him?
I've heard of him. I don't know his work.
Yeah, so he has a video about levels,
Yeah,
really riffing off of your work. It's been
right.
viewed 4 million times on YouTube. I mean, he really has done a lot to tell people about your work. And his question for you is, do you think AQual can be used on a social systemic scale at this point, or is it doomed to remain a niche tool for deep divers? And if the latter, how do we make the best use of it?
Right. Um, well, I don't see any reason that it can't become social or well known in the entire culture. But I think, well, just look at developmental psychology and how many people understand that we go through 6 to 8 stages of growing up. I mean, most people have no idea that they do that. I remember when I first discovered it when I was 14, 15, 16, I was just shocked. I had no idea that I went through these 6 to 8 stages of growing up. I was just absolutely flabbergasted. I just had no vague idea that that was actually happening. But it was, and I learned them, and it really changed my overall view of how I saw the world. And it especially changed my view of how I understood other people, because I would just sort of automatically see if people were in first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, or eighth stage. And that was sort of as far as I went. Eighth stage covered turquoise. And I rarely worried about beyond turquoise, because beyond 0.5% is 0.01%. And that's just not even worth bothering about. But I did recognize it was possible, and that if we had like 300 million people in the United States, then 0.01% would still amount to several 100,000 people. So it was there, but I wasn't one that I really worried about that much. I didn't use that much.
Well, Ken Wilber, for people who want to know more about your work, maybe we'll make that percentage a little bigger. Where should people look for you online?
integrallife.com is a pretty good place to start. You can also look at kenwilber.com. But that's where I would start to look online. And in terms of actual books to get, I think the most recent book I get, which has just been out for a month or so, it's called Finding Radical Wholeness. And I personally think that's the best book I've done. And I've done some 30 books, so that's a fairly tough competition. But I still think it's the best book I've written, so I would recommend people start with that one.
Excellent. We'll put links in the description for people to check out on that book and those websites. And Ken Wilber, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me and to share your work.
My pleasure. Thank you.